null versus undefined in JavaScript. So this is a very common interview question. And then I also think that it's important to just kind of have this understanding when writing your own JavaScript program. So null and undefined, both of them are used for none values. So if you want to represent a value that is nothing within your programs, you are going to use null or undefined. However, you should use null for an intentional none value. And then undefined is for a value that just doesn't exist. So you, the programmer, would assign a value to null, but you would not just assign a value to undefined. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to get a bunch of errors if you do that, but it's generally best practice to just use null when you want to declare a value as a none value instead of undefined. And one of the biggest reasons for this is because JavaScript will never intentionally just assign a value to null. Like JavaScript's not going to implicitly give a value null. However, JavaScript will implicitly give values undefined. So if you try to access a property on an object that doesn't exist, that's going to give you undefined. Or if you just initialize a variable and you don't assign it a value, that's just going to be undefined. So JavaScript will just kind of implicitly give these values undefined. But if you intentionally and explicitly want to give a value a none value, you should use null, because that differentiates, okay, well, does this value just not exist in our program because JavaScript implicitly gave it undefined? Or did a programmer intentionally mean to have this value be a none value? All right, so the differentiation between null and undefined is that null is for an explicit intentional none value, in which undefined is just for a value that doesn't exist. And JavaScript will just implicitly give this the value of undefined. All right, so an example of this is like if you're going to initialize a variable to nothing, then it's probably a good idea to just use null. But if you try to access a property on an object that doesn't exist, you'll get undefined. So here on line 17 and 16, I declare a variable called nothing yet, and I assign it the value of null. And then on line 23 and 24, I create just an empty object, and then I try to access a property on that object that doesn't exist. And when I run my program here, you're going to see that I get null for my first console log statement here because I assign this variable to null. But on my second one here, when I try to access some property, I get undefined because JavaScript's like, hey, this property doesn't exist on my object. So it implicitly gives it undefined. And this allows me to null when I see these values in my program. I know that, hey, I explicitly gave the value on line 16 null. However, JavaScript just implicitly gives this property that doesn't exist undefined. So by explicitly using null when you have a none value, it allows you to kind of see those differentiations in your program there. Now, also, like I said earlier, if you just declare a variable and you just initialize it and you don't assign it anything, then JavaScript implicitly gives it undefined. So on line 30, when I don't give this a value and I console log out some variable that I just initialized it, I didn't give it a value, we get undefined. Now there's some interesting behavior here when it comes to the equals operator when looking at null and undefined. And if we look at null triple equals undefined, so using the strict equality operator, we see that they're not equal to each other, which is probably what we would expect. So if I clear my console and then I run this here, you're going to see false. Null does not triple equal undefined. However, the double equals operator, which I have videos on in more depth of how this works, it's going to allow for type coercion. And since null and undefined are both falsy values within JavaScript, you're actually going to get that these are equal to each other. So for the first line here, null triple equals undefined, we get false. But then for this second line here, null double equals undefined, we get true. So since both of these are falsy values and double equals allows for coercion of types, you actually get that they are loosely equal to each other with the double equals operator. Now, when it comes to being equal to themselves, both null and undefined are strictly equal to themselves. So you can do, null triple equals null, that's going to be true. And undefined triple equals undefined, that is going to be true as well. So both null and undefined are strictly equal to themselves, and they both are loosely equal to themselves as well. So if we run this here, which is what we would expect, like since it's a looser equality operator, we would expect, well, if they're kind of strictly equal to themselves, then the same is probably going to be true for loosely equals, which is also true. So null and undefined in JavaScript both are none values within your program. However, null is for a value in which the programmer explicitly wants to say this value is a none value, meaning they are intentionally giving this value the value of null. But undefined is just implicitly undefined because it doesn't exist in your program. JavaScript will just give that value undefined. All right, so that is the main differentiation between the two. So I hope you enjoyed this video and learned everything you need to know about null and undefined, and I will see you in that next one.